of all, we're going to deal with Indigenous shelter. And this is, in our part of the world, essentially focused on the Kalinago people, who were the last group to occupy our islands and of whom we know the most. Archaeology, as I'm going to show, helps us to understand the positioning of the houses through the post holes and the way those post holes are laid out. But they were dealing with building houses with the resources that were around them. No imports at all. Maybe in their pottery and other things, trading of stone tools with Antigua and pitch with Trinidad and that kind of thing. But generally, it was this amazing knowledge that they had of the forested environment and the type of wood that was to be used and which strengths, what types of wood was strong for which parts of the house. And we'll see this following on later on with the African adaptations and even the French arrivals. So here you have people who are adapting their houses to those environmental things that I talked before, and also ensuring that they have the best use of the resources that are available. And so what we get, for instance, along a lot of the houses, and of course everything is biodegradable, so we depend a lot on archaeology or on very early illustrations of these places. The rosal reed, for instance, a key component in the Kalinago house because it is the thatch of the reed that provides the roof. And then the stem provides the purlines, those golette-like things, and these are put around the house and also along the frame to be able to attach the fronds of the rosal reeds. In the territory, for instance, they use a lot of vetiver, but vetiver is an introduced plant during the 19th century. So obviously vetiver is not something that was used originally. And we have in the records of people like Father Bredon, who lived among the Kalinago in Dominica in the 1640s, early 1650s, we have a great description of the type of houses, etc. So there was this knowledge, the awareness of which kinds of wood were good for the frame. The frames were extremely strong, and they could withstand hurricane winds. It was essentially a pattern where the thatch would go, the frame would remain, and therefore, with quick time, you could then rehabilitate your building. The other thing was that you had a central core, which was where you would retreat at the time of a hurricane, if you did not have caves and other things nearby. But essentially, it was designed so that you had this central core. And you had the adaptation that was taking place from the, when the thatch, you maintained the thatch, but you were then moving into boards, and you were raising your house from the ground. So this is the beginning then of what we eventually call the tikai. So we see the tikai going through stages as it comes in. The thing to note here, with those props, the traps as they call them, on the side of the houses, were to withstand hurricanes so that the houses would not blow over. And the props, in a way, are an extension of the indigenous slopes that were used to anchor the house. And the prop becomes a Creole thing, because with your tikais or small houses in the countryside, particularly on stilts, you needed a frame to ensure that they stood firm. And when we look at some of the diagrams and stuff here, we see, for instance, the various types, the A-frame muina, and then the slightly raised the kabe, which actually is more correctly called a tabui. But there's a very interesting thing that happens in our Kalinago language and in the Creole, that there was the tupinamba Indians from Brazil who were brought up the islands after colonization. And because the French were more in touch with the Tupinamba than the Kalinago, a lot of words like Kabe and other things, they used the Tupi. So in the indigenous language, you have to differentiate what is Kalinago and what is this introduced Tupinamba language. So the Tabui is really the Kalinago name. The Kabe is what the Tupinamba would call a community or a particular house. And here you have a picture of the roseau with all of its components. I mean, it's an amazing plant. The stem, as I said, was for the frames and for the purlines and for attaching the thatch. And the leaves were for thatching. The arrow, the flesh, was for the actual arrows that were used by the Kalinago. They're very light. Also used for cages for birds. There's a whole variety. And then the soft inner core of the leaves were medicinal, and the roots had another purpose as well. So the roseau that we sort of take for granted had all of these important elements within the house. There was this move in the 1970s as we got into the Greater Kalinago awareness period of the young Kalinago emerging and deciding that they're going to form these groups like Carinia, Carifuna, and discover more about their past. And so we have ultimately the Kalinago Barana Aute, which attempts to follow some of these patterns. And I must say that for Hurricane Maria, the community, the houses that were within that complex stood up particularly well.